My favorite part of the brain would have to be the amygdala. The amygdala is located next to the hippocampus. It's part of the frontal portion of the temporal lobe, and it's also part of the limbic system. And everybody has two amygdala, which are called amygdalae. This is just a picture to show you where the amygdala would be located inside of the brain. The amygdala is responsible for producing emotions, perception or results to those emotions, survival instincts, memory, and sexual drive. So how does it work? The amygdala is a processing center. It perceives outside threats and information. It receives signals from senses and internal organs, and it generates a response. The amygdala receives input from all senses as visceral inputs. These inputs come from the hypothalamus, septal area, orbital cortex, and the parabrachial nucleus. It also receives input from the olfactory bulb and auditory, visual, and somatosensory information from the temporal and anterior cingulate cortices. An example of this would be your perceived emotion going to the amygdala, and then it would process and link for perception to the inferotemporal cortex, and this would create an intense emotional memory. The amygdala also has outputs as well. Some of these outputs would be the ventral amygdalofugal pathway. This is the driving pathway to different cortices. This links where motivation and drive through the limbic system, and this can influence responses. Another output would be the stria terminalis. This connects the subcortical structures. Another would be directly to the hippocampus, which has a role in learning and memory. And another one would be the entorhinal cortex, which helps with memory, navigation, and perception of time. And one last one would be the dorsomedial nucleus of the thalamus, and this is associated with feeding, eating, drinking, and circadian rhythm. So why do we need the amygdala? The amygdala senses threat, it heightens your awareness, and it protects you from danger. The central nucleus of the amygdala produces autonomic components of emotion. This means changes in heart rate, blood pressure, and respiration. It also produces conscious perception of the emotion through the ventral amygdalofugal output pathway to places like the prefrontal cortex. Some interesting things to note is that people can have lesions on their amygdalas. One type of lesion is called an irritative lesion on temporal lobe epilepsy. This means that they have an effect of stimulating the amygdala. It can cause panic attacks, and it is shown that PET scans have shown an increase in blood flow to the parahippocampal gyri in the brain. Another type of lesion is called destructive lesion. This is like an ablation on the amygdala, and it has the opposite effect of the irritative lesion. This one will make humans more placid and calm and tameness in animals. Lesions to the amygdala can be caused by an Urbach-Wiethe disease, where calcium is deposited in the amygdala. If this disease occurs early in life, then the patients can't discriminate emotion and facial expressions, but their ability to identify faces remains the same. This is just a picture that I Googled for patients with bilateral amygdala lesions. It didn't specify which one, but you can see here that it's definitely impacting their brain here. When researchers were still trying to understand the function of the amygdala, they would use something called Pavlovian conditioning. Pavlov would also use classical conditioning, but in this example, it would be called fear conditioning. This experiment involved an animal hearing a noise or seeing a visual stimulus, and then a few seconds later, receiving a mild shock. The reactions would involve freezing, elevated blood pressure, and heart rate. They would associate that noise or visual with fear of being shocked, and eventually they will sense the fear without getting a shock. In the discrimination procedure, one sound is paired with shock and another sound is not paired with a shock. The animals could not figure out which noise delivered the shock because the amygdala and hippocampus and thalamus were all trying to work together, but one of them was damaged. And in another experiment, a fear-producing visual stimulus is quickly processed by the thalamus, and this information is passed to the amygdala, which produces a quick response to danger, which is why the animals would perceive threat and a sense of fear once they saw the visual or heard the noise, but yet they did not receive a shock.